So welcome everybody to the 50th anniversary celebration of the DC Preservation League. My name is Rebecca Miller. I'm the executive director of the league, and on behalf of the officers and Board of Trustees staff, I'm pleased to welcome you all to this evening to celebrate our 50th anniversary. Technically, we're 51 years old. We all know what happened the last few years, so yeah, we can avoid that. And I'm pleased to see so many founders, former board members, and staff here tonight, as well as current sponsors, current members, and supporters. Your presence speaks volumes to the value that you all place in an organization like DCPL and to its role in the District of Columbia. I'd like to thank some of our key sponsors for the evening that have supported us throughout the years. The DC Commission on Arts and Humanities, Douglas Development Corporation, QTAC Rock, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Robert Benson, who was kind enough to let us use his photography for this event, Beyer Blinder Bell Architects, Innovation Hub, Edens, EHT Traceries, KCE Structural Engineers. I can't read my own handwriting, I apologize. Quinn Evans, and David M. Schwartz and Associates. The board would also like to thank Allison Owings, Leela Smith, and David Bonderman, and all the other former trustees for lending their names to the honorary committee. Many of you no longer live in the city, however, your ongoing commitment to the organization that you all helped shape is admirable. And I'd also like to take a minute to thank the current board members and staff for their trust in me. For 19 years, the board has supported my efforts to grow the organization, and while sometimes my ideas, like hosting a Beatles 50th anniversary celebration in a vacant building on the coldest winter night in 2014, with more than 2,500 people, may seem insane, or my tactics for saving buildings may seem sometimes outside of the preservation norm, the board has supported me and the staff to achieve these successes, and I look forward to this continued support in the future as we transition to new leadership in June. I first met DCPL's current president, Scott DiMartino, in 2006 at a National Trust Conference in St. Paul. With a practice in tax law specializing in historic tax credit and solar credit syndication, I knew DCPL could benefit from his expertise and commitment to the reuse of treasured historic landmarks across the country. A few years, a few events, and several old fashions later, I convinced Scott to join the board. Initially, he served on DCPL's Government Affairs Committee, assisting with a proposal for a DC tax credit. For whatever reason, this city still can't wrap its head around it, and we still don't have one, but we still push for it. In more recent years, Scott has provided his legal expertise through pro bono legal representation on projects like the demolition appeal of the West Heating Plant and the Founder Branch Trolley Trestle, and amicus briefs on McMillan Reservoir. While Scott will no longer be serving as DCPL's president, he will continue his board service and pro bono legal contributions to the organization. And DCPL's income, Scott, would you like to stand up and say hi so people can see you? And DCPL's incoming president is a veteran preservation advocate. Faye Armstrong came to Washington in 1976 to work for the U.S. Department of State. Over a 30-year career, she focused primarily on legal and policy matters related to Latin America and the Caribbean. On her weekends, she renovated her beautiful 1903 house in Mount Pleasant, learning both what to do and what not to do at times. She has been president of Historic Mount Pleasant since 2006 and is active in the DC Historic Districts Coalition and with other neighborhood preservation groups in the district. Faye has been on the front line of preservation issues, both from a neighborhood and citywide level, and has served as a co-chair of DCPL's Government Affairs Committee for the last 5 years. So please join me in thanking Scott for his service and welcoming our next president, Faye Armstrong. If Faye, you'd like to stand up. And again, thank you to all of you who have supported us in our efforts and for bringing us to this time and place. And speaking of this place, pretty fantastic place, right? I know you all are kind of used to being in vacant buildings with us, but there are working bathrooms. There is air conditioning in here. There is out there too, and it's a little warm today, obviously. We like to do things on the hottest day of the year so far. So we are also celebrating our milestone, but also Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library is celebrating its 50th anniversary. This building was designed by Mies van der Rohe and completed in 1971. And it seems a bit ironic that at the same time that Don't Tear It Down was founded to save an iconic 19th century post office on Pennsylvania Avenue, a building was completed that 50 years later, the same organization would fight to save. If anything, what the last 50 years has taught us is that saving buildings is about recognizing value regardless of fashion and a commitment to continuity in the life of a city and judicious conservation of resources. In short, preservation is a vital element of sustainability. Thank you to the library staff for hosting us this evening. And up next, we have a video of highlights of the last 50 years of Don't Tear It Down and the DC Preservation League. So I hope you enjoy it.
Today, historic preservation in Washington, D.C. is a movement that engages all aspects of the built environment across the diverse communities of the city. At age 50, the D.C. Preservation League's mission has expanded and evolved with the movement. In addition to the preservation of landmarks, the organization plays an essential role in urban planning, education and outreach, nonpartisan advocacy, and the design review of enhancements to historic cityscapes. It has a broad focus that encompasses issues of sustainability, housing affordability, and social justice by advocating the equitable representation of communities whose heritages have been less well documented in the historic record. The DC Preservation League's story began more than a half a century ago during a struggle to preserve key features of Washington from destruction. In 1971, the old post office on Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, a magnificent Richardsonian Romanesque-style building, was slated for partial demolition. Allison Owings, a news writer and producer for NBC affiliate WRC-TV, was distressed at the steady destruction of many of Washington's historic buildings. She wrote eloquently about losing her sense of history and place through the gradual demolition of the historic cityscape. Encouraged by Washington Post architect critic Wolf von Eckerd, Owings decided that a Washington advocacy group was needed. She came up with the name Don't Tear It Down. Historic preservation efforts have been mounted in Washington before, including First Lady Jackie Kennedy's push to save the historic structures lining Lafayette Park in the early 1960s. And in 1964, the National Capital Planning Commission and the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts established the Joint Committee on Landmarks, an advisory group that creates a list of D.C. historic landmarks. The historic preservation movement gained momentum, and in 1966, Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act. The legislation forever changed preservation at the local, state, and federal levels. It invigorated grassroots preservation efforts. However, no legal mechanism existed in the District of Columbia to protect the designated buildings and structures. Meetings for Don't Tear It Down began in Owings' living room, as well as in other homes throughout D.C. She joined forces with Terry B. Morton from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Together, Owings and Morton developed a plan of action along with other National Trust staff and like-minded individuals. Morton focused the group on the fate of the old post office. On April 19, 1971, about 250 placard-carrying preservationists, historians, architects, and local residents gathered on the steps of the old post office to voice their concerns. It was Don't Tear It Down's first street action, and it received a lot of publicity.
Our little feisty group with our handmade signs marched down on Earth Day, 1971, to the old post office building. And someone handed me a bullhorn, which I had never handled before. And I stood on the steps with a bullhorn. And I shouted something thrilling like, "Don't tear it down, don't tear it down." And there was an enormous amount of press there. And I didn't realize it until I saw pictures later. And it turns out that this little notion I had hit a nerve.
After Owings was transferred to WNBC in New York, Layla Smith became the first president of Don't Tear It Down. Smith and numerous volunteers continued the mission to protect the heritage, history, and physical landscape of Washington. The early successes of Don't Tear It Down were monumental. The old post office was saved over a period of years with the help of many people. In particular, Nancy Hanks, chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, for whom the building was later named. In 1974, Don't Tear It Down mounted a campaign to save Franklin School. Designed and constructed by architect Adolf Kloos in 1869. Litigation also helped save the Willard Hotel from demolition that same year. In 1978, Don't Tear It Down advocated for the passage of the Historic Landmark and Historic District Protection Act, ultimately one of the strongest local preservation ordinances in the nation. Drafted by attorney David Bonderman, the act strengthened the legal protection for historic properties and established the DC Inventory of Historic Sites. The legislation also established the Historic Preservation Office and the Historic Preservation Review Board. The preservation movement had begun to shift into an institution. After the grand reopening of the old post office in 1984, the board of directors changed the group's name to reflect a broader scope. Rather than the narrow focus of opposition to planned demolitions, the new name, the DC Preservation League, reflected a more multifaceted, proactive, and comprehensive approach to preservation. The organization championed the preservation of many iconic downtown landmarks, such as the Colorado Building and the Greyhound bus station. In one complex and challenging case, DCPL agreed not to object the demolition of the historic Rhodes Tavern in return for saving major elements of two adjoining structures, the Riggs Building and the National Metropolitan Bank Building. DCPL's success continued and expanded beyond individual historic landmarks. Neighborhood historic districts in Mount Pleasant, 16th Street, Tacoma, Colorama Triangle were established. Thanks to the organization's sponsorship of historic district nominations, many small neighborhood buildings continued to stand. In 1987, in conjunction with the Metropolitan Planning and Housing Association, DCPL initiated the joint project of preserving small buildings downtown. This led to a proposal for the creation of the Downtown Historic District. Historic preservation in Washington was moving beyond landmarks to the very fabric of the city. In 1995, the Enrich Fund was established by family and friends in memory of Mark Collin Enrich, an architectural historian and longtime DCPL volunteer. For more than 10 years, Enrich volunteered his services conducting historic site surveys and researching numerous buildings as part of DCPL's ongoing documentation of Washington's built environment. The fund assists the DCPL and other community groups in documenting buildings and neighborhoods and achieving historic landmarks and historic district designations. Fittingly, the DCPL celebrated its 25th anniversary with a gala dinner and program at the Old Post Office on May 17, 1996. The event attracted significant publicity and brought together old and new supporters to mark the milestone. That same year, DCPL announced its first list of Washington's most endangered places. Periodically updated, the list generates much-needed attention to the deteriorating condition of numerous sites in need of preservation.
The preservation of our city has largely contributed to the fact that Washington, D.C. has an identity.
During the mid-1990s, DCPL faced several challenges. The first was the proposed development of an arena on 7th Street Northwest. Although DCPL and the other organizations opposed the construction, the arena known today as Capital One Arena was ultimately built at Gallery Place. Nevertheless, the efforts helped establish future protocol for the review of such projects. In 1998, the construction of the new convention center north of Mount Vernon Square was proposed. DCPL was a key player in creating the Memorandum of Agreement that provided a $1 million revolving fund for exterior improvements to historic buildings in the vicinity of the project. Additional funds were appropriated to clean and repair the Carnegie Library. An 18-month moratorium on demolition or significant alteration was also put in place for nearby buildings in order to allow for submission of landmark nominations. DCPL furthered its advocacy mission by lobbying the DC Council to remove hurdles of the landmark designation process. It also advocated for legislation prohibiting demolition by neglect. In 1997, the League lobbied the Council to adopt legislation authorizing a historic preservation tax credit. This program was finally funded and implemented in 2007, and it has since been converted into the DC Historic Homeowner Grant Program, administered by the Historic Preservation Office. Boom times continued for Washington real estate into the 2000s, providing preservation opportunities to restore or adapt significant buildings. But development pressures continued to threaten historic buildings and structures in neighborhoods of the district. In 2000, the DCPL co-sponsored a symposium titled New Directions for Historic Preservation, focusing on making Washington's preservation efforts more inclusive to neighborhood concerns. In September 2002, DCPL's first annual Row House Month helped educate city residents on historic value of row houses and provided information about the economic incentives of owning a city home, and advocated for preservation-friendly renovation and restoration.
Preservation and DCPL were in a bit of a transition period at the time. Over the previous 35 years, the preservation movement nationally, and particularly in Washington, had really matured and had become somewhat institutionalized. So a lot of the early work was done. The work of preservation was no longer about pure citizen activism, about people trying to stop bulldozers from coming in the middle of the night or anything like that. It was really about operating within those structures that have been put in place.
DCPL also sponsored a multifaceted exploration of the legacy of Harry Wardman, one of Washington's most prolific early 20th century builders, through a mobile exhibit on Wardman row houses. Another focus in the 2000s was on the city's many mid-century modern properties, which were increasingly threatened with demolition or drastic alteration. DCPL sought to raise the level of appreciation for mid-20th century buildings and to establish that modernism is of equal significance to earlier architectural styles. In 2006, DCPL presented an acclaimed 2-day symposium, DC Modern, followed by another 2-day program, DC Modern Washington Inside. Both sold-out programs, organized by former trustee Joan M. Brierton, brought together for the first time architects, designers, property owners, and other interested participants to highlight the role of modernism in shaping a post-World War II Washington. DCPL's efforts to protect modernist structures were met with mixed success. In 2008, the DCPL nominated National Permanent Building at 1775 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest and was denied landmark status, despite a favorable report from the HPO, because building owners had already begun destroying some of its character-defining elements. As early as 1991, DCPL had co-sponsored, along with the Committee of 100, a landmark nomination for I.M. Pei's Third Church of Christ Scientist at 916th Street. The nomination of that iconic brutalist structure was widely supported by architectural historians and was approved by the HPRB in 2007. Nevertheless, after much publicity, the building was demolished in 2014. DCPL subsequently administered a fund created as a partial mitigation for the destruction of the church that supported preservation initiatives related to other modernist and/or religious structures. This fund has supported preservation projects at numerous properties, including the Tifereth Israel Congregation, St. Mark's Episcopal Church, the Washington National Cathedral, and the Krieger Museum. In the years since, 2 additional grant funds have been established. Over the last 50 years, DCPL has sponsored more than 160 historic landmark nominations and engaged in hard-fought battles for numerous buildings, structures, and districts across Washington. In recent years, DCPL's landmark nomination efforts have reflected a diverse assortment of building types and sites with cultural importance to a wide variety of groups. Recent landmark nominations sponsored or co-sponsored by DCPL have included the Wonder Bread Factory in Shaw, the former Intelsat headquarters on Connecticut Avenue Northwest, the interior of the Corcoran Gallery of Art, the DC Recorder of Deeds building in Judiciary Square, and the Bloomingdale Historic District. Another important landmark nomination sponsored by DCPL was the Uline Arena. Constructed near Union Station in 1931, the former arena was the site of the Beatles' legendary first concert in the United States. DCPL nominated the arena in 2003, and it received historic designation in 2006. Then in 2014, the arena became the site of a gala celebration sponsored by DCPL to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' 1964 concert. The Beatlemania event drew more than 2,700 attendees and garnered national and international press attention. The DC Preservation League has worked in tandem with the Historic Preservation Office for distribution of National Park Service Historic Preservation Fund grants to survey neighborhoods and conduct thematic studies of building types. Another collaboration with HPO on education led to a series of print and online brochures chronicling the social, cultural, and architectural history of Washington's historic districts. DCPL has also collaborated with HPO and other partners on in-depth assessments of historic legacies of underrepresented groups in the District of Columbia, including context studies and multiple property documents describing 20th century African American civil rights sites in Washington, D.C., Black Power in 20th century Washington, and the women's suffrage movement in Washington. Also in collaboration with HPO, DCPL worked to identify sites of importance to the history of the LGBTQ+ community in Washington, sponsoring Annie's Paramount Steakhouse in DuPont Circle for designation as a historic landmark, as well as the Slow Burrell House in Brooklyn. These joined the Dr. Franklin E. Kamini House in the Palisades, the Furies Collective in Capitol Hill as landmarks associated with LGBTQ+ history in the district. DCPL is also co-sponsoring an ongoing project to identify, document, and preserve the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Washington. As the historic preservation movement has matured, it has become an accepted element of public policy nationwide. In the District of Columbia, Don't Tear It Down, DCPL can take substantial credit for this accomplishment. Over the past 50 years, the organization has worked tirelessly to preserve Washington's sense of place and to save many of the unique features that define the capital city's history, architecture, and culture.
The old post office is a perfect example of grassroots advocacy to protect our historic resources. I've been involved in this building for nearly 20 years or so, spent about 5 years to renovate and restore the building and also adapt it for a hotel, so to give it new life and re-engage it again in the city fabric.
The DC Preservation League continues to make an immeasurable contribution to the protection and understanding of the history of the District of Columbia.
I left behind this germ of an organization, but somehow the mycelium around it just spread and it grew to what it is today. And I sure couldn't have done it alone. I sure would not have imagined that it became as mighty as it is and impressive as it is. It's something I'm extremely proud of, but it started with just a little idea, just saving some of these little tiny buildings.
Every member and supporter has a right to be proud of this legacy. Continuing to preserve, protect, and enhance the historic and built environment of Washington, D.C. through advocacy and education remains the DC Preservation League's greatest challenge as it looks forward to its next 50 years of service.
having me. And we obviously couldn't include every important event, every landmark that's been saved, or every person that's been involved, or we would be here all night. And I know you all didn't just come to see me, you came to see each other. If you do have photos of your time with DCPL, or Don't Tear It Down, we would love to be able to have the opportunity to scan them. We do have some archives from Don't Tear It Down in the office, but we would always love to have more. So if I'm just putting out that call, if any of you originators have that kind of information, that would be great. But before we head up for cocktails, I would like to yield the podium to Allison Owings, whose idea all these years ago is what we're here to celebrate. Allison, while being gone from Washington for a long time, writing books, including her most recent oral history book about a formerly homeless man who is now the mayor of the Tenderloin in San Francisco, she is looking for a publisher, if anybody knows of one, has always kept in touch and with those of us who have carried out the work. So Allison, I'd like to invite you up here to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, David. Hello, Sally. Nice to meet Scott. This is a wonderful occasion. And I live in California now, as Rebecca alluded to. And because I live there, I was thinking maybe I'd get a prize for having traveled the farthest to the party. But I think this is much better, so thank you. And yesterday, I took a train from New York to Washington, and I passed a lot of buildings that could use your attention and your skills. And as I was staring at them, I started thinking about and wondering how our lives are affected or affected by permanence and intent and thoughtfulness and thoughtlessness. And then I wondered how so many daily acts of our own lives go beyond possibly what we think of as inconsequential choices. For instance, and I told Howard Berger earlier, my remarks are going to be brief but meandering, and he said we'd be disappointed if people did not meander. So thank you for that, Howard. Well, for instance, just in inconsequential choices in our daily lives, how eating beef impacts the cattle ranching that is encroaching onto the Amazon rainforest, or how accepting a low bid for a plumbing or spackling job might affect the result, or the results of, in any aspect of our lives, cutting corners or talking down to someone. All these actions have an effect. And these are the sort of meandering thoughts I had on the train, and this is what could happen to you too if you score a seat on an Amtrak silent car. But as for acts and decisions beyond our own, I imagine this evening that we are all aware of the vulnerability of the built world as well as of the natural world. And that would be whether in Ukrainian cities whose names some of us are still learning how to pronounce, or throughout this country in communities that lack the power and prestige to keep them in good shape, or in our own capital, what happened to it last year, only a few blocks away. So we all know, too, that not all destruction is deliberate. We know that stone can erode and wood can weather. We know, too, there are many values within the built world, especially in the carefully crafted built world, and sometimes the not so carefully crafted. In my opinion, we know or sense one value of the well-built world, and which is that it binds us. This might seem a little woo-woo, and I'm not a woo-woo person, but it's the tactile tangibility of the built world that, in my opinion, as well as the intangibility that binds us to our world. It's part of our continuum. So to me, this built world reflects the architects and the craftspeople who may have thought, I did good work. That building, that design, that carving, the brickwork or the AC system, that's worth keeping. And it will be part of this block or part of this neighborhood, part of the city. Surely it will stand. And I think that people who live in such buildings or work in them or go by them probably felt the same way too. And many, as we know, have been proven wrong. That's what gave me the idea for Don't Tear It Down. And that is why I salute you this evening for taking my disgruntlement and that of other disgruntlees to a realm that has stunned me for, yes, 51 years. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. I've always appreciated all of your memories of the organization and your support along the way. So with that, that will conclude the program for tonight. And I just have one final request, other than to thank all of you for coming and to thank all the sponsors who you can see ads in your program book. Please take it with you and go through it when you get home. You don't have to, we'll have some on the way out too, so you don't have to feel like you have to carry it around all evening while you're enjoying your snacks. But I would ask that the founders and former trustees and current trustees, if they could hang back and come down to the front for a group photo prior to joining the reception. So if you all would humor me in that regard, I would very much appreciate it. So with that, I release you to the reception. Enjoy yourself.